Around 252 million years ago, something began to go wrong with the planet. At first, nothing looked unusual. The oceans were still there, forests still covered the land, animals moved as they always had. But beneath that surface, the rules that kept life alive were starting to change. Slowly, silently, the oceans began losing oxygen, not in a way you could see, but in a way life could feel. Entire regions of water became harder to survive in, then impossible. On land, the same pattern followed. Species did not vanish all at once. They disappeared in small, quiet absences. One gone, then another, then more. At the same time, deep beneath the earth, something vast had begun. Volcanoes on a scale almost impossible to imagine. They did not erupt once. They continued for thousands of years, releasing gases that changed the air itself, trapping heat, altering the balance that life depended on. The oceans responded, the atmosphere shifted, and the system that supported life began to break. This was not a sudden disaster, it was a slow unraveling. Scientists believe that during this time, most life in the oceans disappeared. On land, life came close to the same fate. For a moment in Earth's history, complex life itself stood on the edge of collapse, and it nearly did not recover. Today, we return to the most dangerous era in Earth's history, a time when the planet itself turned against life in ways we are still trying to understand. Before we go further, I'm curious to know, did you come here to relax your mind or to learn something new? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy calm, immersive journeys into Earth's history, consider subscribing to The Snoozy Scientist. Now, let's return to that world and see how it all began. Across a single vast landmass that gathered much of the world together, life moved through its patterns with quiet continuity, as if the systems beneath it had settled into a long, steady rhythm. Seasons shifted in familiar cycles, currents flowed with dependable paths, and the boundaries between ocean and land supported a richness that had taken millions of years to assemble. There was no visible strain in these connections, no signal that the balance holding everything in place had begun to weaken. Beneath the surface of the oceans, life layered itself into intricate relationships that extended from the smallest drifting organisms to the largest hunters moving through open water. Nutrients rose from deeper regions, feeding blooms of microscopic life that in turn sustained creatures higher in the chain. Reef systems grew slowly in the shallows, their structures forming habitats that sheltered countless species, each one occupying a narrow role within a wider network. These environments were not static, but they remained stable enough for complexity to deepen over time, allowing ecosystems to become both diverse and resilient. Along the edges of these seas, where water met land, life found additional ways to expand. Rivers carried minerals and organic matter into coastal regions, enriching habitats that supported dense communities of organisms. Movement between environments was common, with species adapting to shifting conditions while still relying on the broader stability of the planet. Nothing in these transitions suggested fragility. Instead, they reflected a world that had learned to sustain itself through interconnected systems that reinforced one another. On land, the same sense of continuity extended across forests that spread over wide regions of the supercontinent. Vegetation anchored the soil and shaped the atmosphere, exchanging gases in a balance that supported both plant and animal life. Within these forests, reptiles, amphibians, and early mammal-like forms moved through established ecological roles, feeding, reproducing, and adapting in ways that reflected long periods of evolutionary refinement. Diversity did not appear chaotic but organized, with each species contributing to a larger equilibrium that remained largely undisturbed. The climate, while not uniform, provided conditions that most life forms could endure and navigate. Temperature ranges, rainfall patterns, and seasonal changes created variation, yet this variation stayed within limits that ecosystems could absorb. Organisms evolved in response to these conditions, but they did not face extremes that would force rapid or desperate adaptation. Instead, change occurred gradually, allowing life to adjust without losing its foundation. What made this world remarkable was not only its diversity, but the quiet confidence of its stability. Systems interacted smoothly, feedback loops maintained balance, and disruptions were absorbed before they could spread. From the surface, there was little to suggest that anything essential was missing or beginning to fail. The planet appeared to function as it always had, with life continuing its long, uninterrupted story. In this steady state, there was no clear sign of the transformations that would follow, no visible boundary separating a thriving world from the conditions that would soon reshape it. The strength of this balance, built over immense spans of time, made what came next all the more difficult to trace, as if the foundations themselves had shifted without leaving a single obvious mark. Long before absence became visible, the record of life had already begun to thin in ways that left no clear boundary between what was stable and what was quietly changing. Layers of sediment, settling year after year, preserved the remains of organisms that had once been common. Yet within these layers, subtle differences began to emerge. Certain forms appeared less often, their presence fading gradually rather than stopping outright, as if their place within the system had begun to loosen without any single cause to point toward. In the shallow seas where communities once maintained a steady balance, the composition of life shifted in ways that would have been impossible to notice in a single lifetime. Species that depended on precise conditions found those conditions drifting, not far enough to force immediate collapse, but enough to create strain that accumulated slowly. Reproduction rates altered, growth patterns adjusted, and survival became slightly less certain with each passing generation. Nothing moved abruptly, yet the overall pattern began to change. At a chemical level, the waters themselves carried the earliest signs of this shift. The balance of dissolved gases, nutrients, and trace elements began to move away from its previous stability. These changes were not dramatic, but they influenced how organisms interacted with their environment. Metabolic processes that had functioned reliably for long periods now operated under conditions that were subtly different, creating pressures that were distributed unevenly across species. Some adapted for a time, while others began to decline. Climate patterns followed a similar path, adjusting in ways that did not immediately disrupt the broader system, but introduced variability where consistency had once prevailed. Temperature ranges widened slightly, seasonal cycles became less predictable, and regional conditions began to diverge from their established norms. These shifts were gentle enough to pass without notice, yet they affected the timing of life processes, from migration to reproduction, altering the coordination that ecosystems depended upon. On land, the effects were equally quiet. Populations fluctuated in ways that could be explained as natural variation, yet over extended periods, These fluctuations revealed a pattern of gradual reduction in certain groups. Habitats remained in place, and the structures of ecosystems appeared intact, but the relationships within them were beginning to loosen. Interactions that once supported stability became less reliable, as if the underlying connections had begun to weaken. The most striking aspect of this period was how easily these changes could be overlooked. Each individual shift was small, contained, and seemingly unconnected to the others. There was no single event that marked a turning point, no visible disturbance that signaled a larger transformation. Instead, the system adjusted in many places at once, each change reinforcing the next in ways that were not immediately apparent. Taken together, these early signals formed the beginning of a transition that would only later reveal its full scale. The evidence remains scattered across environments and preserved only in fragments, requiring time and careful observation to assemble into a coherent picture. What appeared stable on the surface carried within it the first indications that the balance-sustaining life had already begun to move away from its long-held state. Far to the north, beneath a landscape that gave no immediate sign of what lay below, the crust of the earth began to open along immense fractures that reached deep into the mantle. What emerged was not a single eruption rising and fading into memory, but a sustained outpouring of molten rock that continued beyond the span of any ordinary geological event. The surface split and flooded with basaltic lava, spreading outward in thick, dark sheets that advanced slowly yet relentlessly, reshaping the land beneath them as they moved. These flows did not remain confined to isolated regions. They expanded across vast distances, layering upon one another until entire expanses of terrain were buried beneath repeated waves of solidifying rock. Each pulse of magma added to the last, creating a landscape built from accumulation rather than singular force. Over time, these layers formed one of the most extensive volcanic provinces the planet has ever known, covering regions so wide that their scale could only be understood from far beyond the surface itself. The activity persisted not for a brief interval, but across an immense stretch of time, continuing through cycles that allowed little opportunity for recovery in the surrounding environment. Periods of relative quiet gave way to renewed surges, and each resurgence brought fresh volumes of lava and gases into the atmosphere. The continuity of this process distinguished it from more familiar eruptions, which rise sharply and fade. Here, the system remained active, sustained by processes deep within the earth that continued to feed it. Alongside the molten rock, vast quantities of gases were released with each eruption. Carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere in steadily increasing amounts, altering the balance that had long regulated the planet's temperature. Sulfur compounds rose as well, forming aerosols that could reflect sunlight for a time before settling and interacting with the surface below. These emissions did not act in isolation, but accumulated, each contributing to a gradual shift in atmospheric composition that unfolded over extended periods. The interaction between these gases and the environment introduced additional layers of change. As sulfur compounds combined with moisture in the air, they formed acidic precipitation that returned to the surface, affecting soils, vegetation, and waterways. The effects were not uniform, but spread unevenly across regions, creating localized stress that added to broader environmental shifts already underway. Meanwhile, The continued addition of greenhouse gases began to influence global temperatures, altering the delicate balance that had once held steady. What made this volcanic activity particularly significant was not only its scale, but its persistence. It did not conclude after a single phase, nor did it allow the planet to return to its prior state between eruptions. Instead, it maintained pressure on multiple systems at once, gradually reshaping the conditions that life depended upon. The land beneath the flows transformed, the air above them thickened with new compositions, and the connections between surface and atmosphere became increasingly altered. In this prolonged unfolding, the eruptions became more than a geological event. They formed a continuous influence, extending their effects far beyond the regions they directly covered, setting into motion changes that would reach across oceans and continents, carried not by force alone, but by the steady accumulation of conditions that no longer resembled what had come before. High above the surface, where the atmosphere blends gradually into the quiet of space, the balance of gases began to shift in a way that left no immediate trace for the living world below. The change did not arrive as a visible cloud or a sudden darkening of the sky, but as a slow accumulation, each addition subtle enough to pass unnoticed, yet together forming a new composition that would alter how the planet held and released heat. With each pulse of volcanic activity, carbon dioxide entered the air in increasing amounts, joining what was already present and steadily raising its overall concentration. This gas, transparent and without scent, interacted with incoming sunlight and outgoing thermal energy in ways that changed the behavior of the atmosphere itself. Energy that once escaped more freely into space began to linger, held within the lower layers of air, gently increasing the warmth near the surface over extended periods. The effect was not immediate, nor was it uniform. Regions responded differently depending on their geography and existing climate patterns, yet the overall trend moved in a single direction. Temperatures began to rise, not sharply, but with a consistency that made reversal difficult. Seasonal variations shifted, and areas that once experienced predictable cycles began to move beyond their familiar ranges. The stability that had allowed life to settle into equilibrium was gradually replaced by conditions that required constant adjustment. At the same time, other gases released alongside carbon dioxide contributed to a more complex transformation. Sulfur compounds, carried upward from deep within the earth, interacted with moisture in the atmosphere, forming fine particles that drifted through the air. These particles influenced how sunlight was scattered and absorbed, sometimes cooling the surface temporarily, at other times contributing to chemical reactions that altered precipitation. The atmosphere became more than a simple medium for gases, turning into an active system where interactions multiplied and outcomes became less predictable. Closer to the surface, the quality of the air began to change in ways that affected the organisms that depended on it. In certain regions, the concentration of volcanic emissions likely reached levels that made breathing more difficult for many forms of life. The air, once a stable mixture that supported respiration without strain, carried compounds that introduced stress at a biological level. Plants, animals, and microorganisms all encountered conditions that were slightly outside the range they had evolved to tolerate. These changes did not isolate themselves from other systems. As the atmosphere warmed, it influenced the oceans, altering surface temperatures and circulation patterns. The connection between air and water, always present, became more pronounced as shifts in one system reinforced changes in the other. What had begun as a gradual alteration in atmospheric composition extended outward, touching every part of the planet in subtle but persistent ways. There was no clear moment when the air became different, no boundary that separated what had been from what it was becoming. Instead, the transformation unfolded continuously, each small change adding to the last, until the conditions that surrounded life were no longer quite the same as before, even if they still appeared familiar at a glance. Temperature does not rise all at once across a world as large as this. It gathers slowly, settling first into patterns that seem familiar, then drifting beyond them in ways that only become clear over extended time. The warmth introduced into the atmosphere began to circulate, carried by winds and currents that connected distant regions, allowing the change to spread without drawing attention to any single place. Across the surface, the difference was subtle at first. Days held slightly more heat, nights released a little less, and seasonal boundaries softened in ways that blurred the distinction between what had once been stable cycles. These shifts did not interrupt life immediately, but they altered the background conditions against which every organism functioned. The margin between comfort and stress narrowed, not abruptly, but with a steady pressure that accumulated over generations. In the oceans, this warmth moved through the upper layers and gradually into deeper waters, carried by circulation patterns that linked the entire system together. Water that once held a consistent temperature began to fluctuate, and regions that had long remained within narrow ranges started to drift beyond them. Marine organisms, finely tuned to these conditions, encountered environments that required adjustment at a pace that was difficult to match. Metabolic rates shifted, growth slowed in some species, and reproductive cycles became less predictable. On land, the effects unfolded with equal persistence. Heat spread across continents, influencing soil moisture, vegetation, and the delicate balance between evaporation and rainfall. Areas that had supported stable ecosystems began to experience longer periods of dryness, while others saw changes in precipitation that disrupted established patterns. Plants, rooted in place and dependent on consistent conditions, responded gradually, but their responses altered the availability of resources for the animals that depended on them. As these changes continued, certain regions began to cross thresholds that existing life forms could no longer tolerate. Temperatures moved beyond the ranges that had shaped evolution for long spans of time, creating environments where survival became increasingly difficult. Some species shifted their ranges in search of more suitable conditions, while others remained and faced mounting stress that reduced their ability to compete, reproduce, or endure. What distinguished this warming was not its intensity at any single moment, but its persistence. It did not arrive as a brief surge that could be endured and then left behind. Instead, it continued, each increment building upon the last, leaving little opportunity for systems to return to their previous state. Adaptation, which often relies on gradual change, struggled to keep pace with a transformation that, while slow in human terms, was rapid on an evolutionary scale. The connection between atmosphere and surface deepened as the retained heat influenced every layer of the environment. Air, water, and land responded together, each reinforcing the others in a cycle that sustained the warming trend. Over time, the world that had once maintained a narrow balance of temperature began to settle into a new state, one that pressed steadily against the limits of what many forms of life could endure. Not through sudden force, but through an unbroken continuity that allowed no return to what had been. At the boundary where water meets the unseen chemistry dissolved within it, a quiet limitation began to take shape, one that did not alter the surface in any obvious way, yet reached into every depth where life depended on the balance between oxygen and motion. The oceans, vast and interconnected, had long carried enough dissolved oxygen to sustain complex organisms, but as temperatures continued their slow rise, that capacity began to diminish. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold, a simple property that gradually shifted the conditions within marine environments. As surface layers absorbed more heat, their ability to retain dissolved oxygen declined, creating subtle differences that extended downward through circulation. These changes did not remove oxygen entirely, but they reduced its availability in ways that forced organisms to operate closer to their limits. The margin that once allowed for stability narrowed, and life that depended on consistent supply began to encounter strain. Across different regions, the effects appeared uneven yet connected. In some areas, oxygen levels fell just enough to alter behavior, causing animals to adjust their movements or reduce activity to conserve energy. In others, the decline reached thresholds where certain species could no longer maintain their normal functions. Respiration, growth, and reproduction all depend on oxygen, and even slight reductions introduced pressures that accumulated over time. The ocean did not become empty, but it became more difficult to live within. Marine animals responded in ways shaped by their mobility and tolerance. Some moved toward regions where conditions remained more favorable, following gradients of temperature and oxygen that shifted slowly across the water. These migrations were not always direct or complete, as suitable habitats became less predictable and more fragmented. Other species, limited by their physiology or by the environments they inhabited, remained in place and faced the gradual tightening of conditions around them. The impact extended beyond individual organisms to the structure of entire ecosystems. As certain species declined or moved, the relationships that connected them began to loosen. Predators found fewer prey in familiar areas, while prey species encountered changes in both food availability and competition. The intricate balance that had once allowed marine communities to function with resilience became less stable as each alteration influenced the next in ways that were not immediately visible. At deeper levels, where circulation patterns once delivered oxygen-rich waters, the changes introduced further complexity. Reduced mixing between surface and depth limited the renewal of oxygen in lower regions, allowing areas of low concentration to expand gradually. These zones did not form abruptly, but grew over time, creating layers within the ocean where life struggled to persist. Organisms adapted to narrow ranges found themselves confined, or displaced, their environments shifting beyond the conditions that had supported them. What emerged from this process was not a sudden collapse, but a steady weakening of the systems that sustained marine life. Oxygen, an invisible yet essential element, became less available, and with that reduction came a cascade of adjustments that rippled through every level of the ocean. The change remained quiet, unfolding without spectacle, yet it touched the foundation of life in ways that would continue to shape what could endure within these waters. There are places in the ocean where movement slows, where currents weaken and the exchange between layers becomes limited, allowing conditions to settle into stillness that carries unseen consequences. Within these regions, the gradual loss of oxygen did not remain confined, but began to spread outward, forming zones where the balance necessary for complex life could no longer be maintained. These areas did not appear different from above, their surfaces unchanged, yet below, the chemistry had shifted in ways that altered everything living within them. As oxygen concentrations continued to decline, boundaries formed between waters that could support life and those that could not. These boundaries were not fixed lines, but shifting gradients that expanded and contracted with temperature and circulation. Over time, the regions of low oxygen grew, connecting previously isolated pockets into larger expanses, where conditions became increasingly difficult to endure. The ocean, once continuous in its support for life, began to divide into areas of varying habitability. Organisms that required higher levels of oxygen found themselves pressed against these invisible limits. Some attempted to remain near the edges, where conditions were marginal but still survivable, while others moved in search of more stable environments. Yet, as these low oxygen zones expanded, suitable habitats became fewer and more fragmented. Movement offered only temporary relief, as the broader trend continued to reduce the availability of space where life could function normally. For species unable to relocate, the effects unfolded with quiet persistence. Reduced oxygen levels interfered with basic biological processes, limiting the ability to generate energy, grow, and reproduce. These changes did not produce sudden collapse, but a gradual weakening where individuals survived for a time under strain before populations began to decline. The absence of struggle was part of what made this process difficult to perceive, as life diminished without visible signs of conflict or destruction. In deeper regions, where renewal of oxygen depended on the slow movement of water from above, the expansion of these zones created environments that remained depleted for extended periods. The lack of mixing allowed conditions to stabilize in a state unfavorable to most complex organisms, effectively transforming these areas into spaces where life could not persist. The ocean floor, once home to diverse communities, became quieter as fewer species were able to survive within these altered conditions. The impact extended upward through the layers, influencing not only those organisms directly affected by low oxygen, but also those connected through ecological relationships. As certain species declined or disappeared, the networks that linked them to others began to unravel. Predators encountered fewer prey, and the flow of energy through the system weakened, further reducing the resilience of marine ecosystems. What emerged was not a sudden collapse, but a steady expansion of conditions that restricted life more and more with each passing interval. The seas did not change their appearance, and no single event marked the transformation. Instead, the process unfolded in silence as oxygen diminished, habitats contracted, and life receded from regions that had once supported it, leaving behind a pattern of absence that could only be understood over time. In waters where oxygen had already thinned beyond what most organisms could tolerate, another process began to take hold, one that had always existed in smaller, contained forms, but now found the conditions it needed to expand. Microbial life, adapted to environments where oxygen was scarce or absent, began to grow more prominent, shifting the balance within these regions in ways that extended beyond simple depletion. Among these microorganisms were bacteria capable of using sulfur compounds instead of oxygen to sustain their metabolism. In environments where oxygen no longer limited their growth, they multiplied and spread, occupying spaces that had once supported more complex forms of life. Their activity did not produce visible change at the surface, yet within the water column, it altered the chemical structure in ways that introduced a new and dangerous element into the environment. As these bacteria processed sulfur compounds, they released hydrogen sulfide, a gas that carries properties highly toxic to most forms of life. In small amounts, it can exist without widespread consequence, but as production increased, concentrations rose to levels that affected entire regions. This gas interferes with cellular respiration, disrupting the ability of organisms to use oxygen even when it is present, effectively compounding the stress already imposed by declining oxygen levels. The presence of hydrogen sulfide created conditions that were hostile to a wide range of marine organisms. Fish, invertebrates, and many other species found themselves exposed to environments where survival became increasingly difficult. Unlike the gradual strain caused by warming or reduced oxygen alone, this introduced a more immediate form of stress, one that could lead to rapid decline once certain thresholds were reached. Yet even this process unfolded without visible disturbance, occurring beneath the surface where its effects remained largely unseen. Evidence preserved in sediments suggests that these toxic conditions were not isolated, but spread through portions of the ocean over time. Layers of rock contain chemical signatures that indicate the presence of hydrogen sulfide in environments that once supported diverse life. These signals reveal a pattern of expansion, where regions influenced by these bacteria grew larger, connecting areas that had previously remained separate. The ocean, already under strain, became increasingly dominated by conditions that favored microbial processes over complex ecosystems. In some cases, the influence of hydrogen sulfide may have extended beyond the water itself. When concentrations became high enough near the surface, this gas could enter the atmosphere, introducing toxicity into regions where air and water interact. Coastal environments, where many organisms depend on both systems, would have been particularly affected, as the boundary between ocean and atmosphere carried these changes outward. The transformation did not replace one stable system with another, but introduced instability at a fundamental level. Chemical conditions shifted in ways that reduced the ability of ecosystems to recover, reinforcing the decline already underway. Life that had adapted to earlier changes now faced an additional layer of challenge, one that further limited the range of environments in which it could persist. Within this unfolding process, the ocean became not only a place of reduced oxygen, but one where toxicity itself shaped the boundaries of survival, quietly redefining what could endure within its depths. Along the narrow margins where ocean and land meet, conditions that once supported dense and varied life began to shift in ways that reached beyond the water itself. These boundary regions, shaped by the constant exchange between air and sea, became pathways through which changes moved outward, carrying with them substances that altered both environments at once. What had been a place of connection slowly became a place of exposure. As hydrogen sulfide accumulated in certain parts of the ocean, its presence did not remain contained beneath the surface. In areas where waters rose or mixed more actively, this gas could enter the air above, blending into the atmosphere in concentrations that varied from region to region. The transition was not dramatic, but it introduced a new element into coastal air, one that many organisms had never encountered at meaningful levels. Breathing, which had once required no adaptation, became more difficult in places where these compounds gathered. Water, too, carried this transformation. Coastal zones, already influenced by shifts in temperature and circulation, now contained mixtures that affected the organisms living within them. Fish, invertebrates, and other marine life encountered conditions where the chemistry of their surroundings interfered directly with essential biological processes. Exposure did not always lead to immediate disappearance, but it introduced stress that reduced survival over time, weakening populations that had once thrived. On land, the influence extended further. Vegetation near shorelines, dependent on stable interactions between soil, water, and air, faced changes that disrupted these relationships. Gases dissolved into moisture, altering precipitation and affecting the surfaces on which plants depended. Leaves, roots, and microbial communities in the soil all encountered conditions that differed from those under which they had developed. The effects were uneven, yet persistent, shaping landscapes in subtle but meaningful ways. Animals that moved between land and water found themselves particularly affected by this convergence of changes. Species that relied on coastal habitats for feeding or breeding encountered environments where both air and water carried new risks. Their movements, once guided by stable patterns, became less predictable as suitable conditions shifted or disappeared. Some withdrew to regions less affected, while others remained and faced increasing difficulty in sustaining their populations. What made this stage distinct was the way the environment itself began to act as a source of pressure, rather than simply a setting in which life adapted. The boundaries that had once supported exchange now carried elements that limited survival, and the systems that connected different parts of the planet transmitted these changes across broader areas. The result was not a single hostile zone, but a network of regions where conditions varied in intensity yet shared a common direction. There was no singular event that marked the transformation, no moment when the world became entirely different. Instead, the shift unfolded gradually, as toxic elements moved through air and water, altering the conditions that organisms depended upon. Life continued where it could, adjusting where possible, but the range of environments that supported it grew narrower, shaped increasingly by factors that operated beyond the control of any individual species. There comes a point in any system where gradual change no longer remains gradual, where pressures that once accumulated quietly begin to converge, and the balance that held everything together gives way without a single visible break. In the oceans, this moment did not arrive as a sudden event, but as a threshold crossed across many regions at once, where the combined effects of warming, oxygen loss, and toxicity reshaped the conditions that had once supported an immense diversity of life. Species that had endured earlier shifts found themselves facing multiple stresses at the same time, each one limiting survival in a different way. Energy could no longer be generated as efficiently. Environments became less predictable, and the spaces where organisms could function normally grew smaller. Populations that had already been reduced began to decline more rapidly, not through violent disruption, but through the quiet accumulation of conditions that no longer allowed them to sustain themselves. Across shallow marine environments, reef systems that had taken vast spans of time to develop began to disappear. These structures, built by countless generations of organisms, depended on stable chemistry and temperature to persist. As these conditions shifted beyond their tolerances, the organisms responsible for maintaining reefs could no longer survive in sufficient numbers. The framework remained for a time, but without the living processes that sustained it, it began to erode, leaving behind fewer habitats for the species that once depended on its complexity. In open waters and along the seafloor, entire groups of organisms vanished from the record, their absence marking a change that extended beyond individual species. Lineages that had persisted through previous fluctuations could not adapt to the combination of factors now shaping the ocean. Their disappearance altered the structure of ecosystems, removing connections that had linked different levels of life together. What remained was not simply reduced diversity, but a transformation of how marine systems functioned. The collapse unfolded across the globe, affecting regions that had once been separated by distance and environment. Local variations remained, but the overall pattern was consistent as ecosystems lost their complexity and resilience. Food webs unraveled as the loss of smaller organisms disrupted the availability of energy for larger ones. Predators encountered fewer prey, and the interactions that had once maintained balance weakened, leading to further declines. What made this collapse distinct was its scale and its reach. It did not remain confined to isolated habitats, but extended across nearly all marine environments, reshaping the structure of life in the oceans as a whole. The continuity that had once linked these systems allowed the effects to spread as changes in one region influenced others, reinforcing a process that moved steadily towards simplification. In the absence of these interconnected networks, the ocean became quieter, not in sound, but in activity. The density of life decreased, the variety of forms diminished, and the dynamic exchanges that had once defined marine ecosystems gave way to a more limited range of interactions. The collapse did not erase life entirely, but it reduced it to a state where much of what had once existed could no longer be sustained, leaving behind a world that no longer resembled the one that had come before. Energy in the ocean moves quietly, passed from one form of life to another in a sequence so continuous that its motion is rarely noticed, yet every part of it depends on what came before. When the smallest organisms began to decline, the effect did not remain at that level, but moved upward through each connection, altering the flow that sustained everything above it. What had once been a steady transfer became uneven, then uncertain. At the base of these systems, microscopic producers and small drifting organisms had long converted available resources into forms that could support higher life. As conditions shifted, their populations became less stable, fluctuating in ways that reduced the consistency of what they provided. This change was not always dramatic, but it disrupted the foundation upon which larger organisms depended, creating gaps that could not easily be filled. Small consumers that relied on these base layers encountered irregular availability, affecting their growth and reproduction. Their own numbers began to decline or shift, and with them went the next link in the chain. Each reduction carried forward, influencing species that fed upon them, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual thinning of connections that once held firm. The structure remained for a time, but its strength diminished as each level lost stability. Predators, adapted to environments where prey had been reliably present, began to encounter increasing difficulty. Hunting patterns that had once been efficient became less so, as the distribution of prey changed and overall abundance declined. Some species adjusted by expanding their range or altering their behavior, but these adjustments could only compensate for so much. When the underlying availability of energy decreased, even the most adaptable organisms faced limits. The unraveling did not occur all at once, but in a sequence that moved through ecosystems step by step. Each loss created conditions that made further losses more likely, as interactions weakened and resilience diminished. Feedback loops that had once maintained balance began to operate in reverse, amplifying instability rather than correcting it. Recovery, which depends on the ability of systems to absorb change, became increasingly difficult as the number of stable connections declined. In some regions, this process led to simplified ecosystems, where only a small number of species remained, interacting in limited ways. The richness that had once defined these environments gave way to more uniform conditions, where fewer pathways existed for energy to move. This reduction did not eliminate life, but it constrained it, shaping systems that were less complex and more vulnerable to further disturbance. What made this breakdown particularly significant was its cumulative nature. No single loss explained the full extent of the change, yet together they transformed the structure of marine life. The interconnectedness that had once supported diversity became a pathway through which instability spread, linking distant parts of the system in a shared decline. As these changes continued, the capacity of ecosystems to recover diminished further, not because recovery was impossible, but because the conditions required for it had been altered beyond what most organisms could accommodate. The ocean remained, its surface unchanged, but the flow of energy within it had been reshaped, leaving behind a quieter, less connected world where the pathways that once sustained life had grown faint. Beyond the reach of the oceans, the land did not remain untouched by what had already begun to unfold. Changes that had taken shape in water and air extended gradually across continents, carried through shifts in temperature, moisture, and atmospheric composition. The surface still appeared familiar, yet the conditions sustaining life within it were no longer as stable as before. Plant life, rooted in place and dependent on consistent cycles, began to experience the first signs of strain. Temperature ranges drifted beyond the limits that had supported steady growth, while patterns of rainfall shifted in ways that altered the availability of water and soil. Some regions grew drier over extended periods, while others experienced irregular fluctuations that disrupted established rhythms. These changes did not erase vegetation at once, but they reduced its reliability, altering how and where plants could thrive. As plant communities adjusted, their distribution became less uniform. Areas that had once supported dense growth began to thin, while other regions saw shifts in the types of plants that could survive there. These transformations influenced not only the appearance of the landscape, but the availability of resources for the animals that depended on them. Leaves, seeds, and other forms of plant matter became less predictable in both quantity and timing, creating challenges for species that relied on steady supply. Herbivores, closely tied to these plant systems, encountered the consequences of these changes directly. Feeding patterns that had once aligned with seasonal growth became less reliable as the timing and abundance of vegetation shifted. Some species adapted by expanding their range or altering their diet, but these adjustments required energy and flexibility that not all organisms possessed. For many, the gradual reduction in available food led to declining populations, as survival became more difficult over successive generations. Predators, in turn, felt the effects through their dependence on herbivores. As prey became less abundant or more dispersed, hunting grew less efficient, and the energy required to sustain life increased. This did not result in immediate disappearance, but in a slow reduction where fewer individuals could maintain the balance needed to survive and reproduce. The connections that linked these levels of life began to weaken, mirroring patterns already established elsewhere. The transformation of land ecosystems unfolded in a way that paralleled changes in the oceans, not through sudden disruption, but through a steady alteration of the conditions that supported life. Each level responded to the one beneath it, creating a chain of adjustments that moved through the system with quiet persistence. Stability gave way to variability, and variability introduced challenges that accumulated over time. What had once been a network of interactions grounded in consistency began to shift toward a state where each component operated under increasing uncertainty. The land remained, its contours unchanged, yet the life within it moved differently, shaped by forces that had already begun to redefine what could endure. Moisture once arrived with a quiet regularity, moving through the air, settling into the ground, and returning again in a cycle that supported the steady growth of vegetation across wide regions. As the climate continued to shift, this rhythm began to change, not through sudden absence, but through irregular patterns that altered how water moved across the land. Rainfall no longer followed its established course, and the balance between wet and dry periods grew less predictable, shaping conditions in ways that plants struggled to accommodate. In some areas, extended dryness began to dominate, reducing the availability of water in soils that had long supported dense plant life. In others, precipitation arrived unevenly, sometimes in brief, intense periods that the land could not fully absorb. These changes disrupted the delicate exchange between roots, soil, and atmosphere, limiting the ability of plants to maintain their growth and resilience. What had once been a continuous cover of vegetation began to thin as species adapted to stable moisture patterns found themselves under increasing stress. Forests, which depended on these consistent cycles, were particularly affected. Trees that had grown over long periods faced conditions that no longer matched the environments in which they had developed. Reduced water availability weakened their ability to transport nutrients, while fluctuations in temperature added further strain. The decline did not occur all at once, but through a gradual process in which fewer new individuals established themselves and existing trees became more vulnerable to the changing conditions around them. As forest cover diminished, the ground beneath it began to change as well. Roots that had once held soil in place and regulated the movement of water no longer performed their role with the same effectiveness. Without this structure, the surface became more exposed to the forces of wind and rain, allowing soil to shift and erode more easily. Nutrients that had been retained within stable systems were carried away, reducing the capacity of the land to support new growth. This transformation altered the landscape in ways that extended beyond individual plants. Open areas expanded where dense vegetation had once stood, changing how sunlight reached the surface and how heat was absorbed and released. The absence of canopy cover influenced local climates, creating conditions that further reinforced the decline of remaining plant life. Each change contributed to the next, forming a pattern that gradually reshaped entire regions. Animals that depended on forests encountered environments that no longer provided the shelter and resources they required. As plant life receded, the structures that supported diverse habitats disappeared, leaving fewer places where organisms could find food and protection. The interactions that had once defined these ecosystems became less frequent, reflecting the broader changes unfolding across the land. The disappearance of forests did not mark an abrupt end, but a transition toward a different state, where the features that had once defined the landscape were replaced by more exposed and less stable conditions. The land remained, its form recognizable, yet the systems that had supported its richness shifted into something quieter, shaped by patterns that no longer favored the growth that had once covered it. Silence began to gather in places that had once carried constant movement, not as an absence that arrived all at once, but as a gradual thinning of presence that became more noticeable over time. Across the land, the variety of life that had filled forests, plains, and river edges started to contract, leaving behind fewer forms to occupy spaces that had once supported a wide range of organisms. The shift did not appear as sudden disappearance, but as a steady reduction in the number of species that could endure the changing conditions. Many animals that had thrived under earlier stability found themselves unable to adapt to the combined pressures now shaping their environment. Heat, shifting moisture, and reduced plant life created challenges that extended beyond any single factor, affecting how organisms moved, fed, and reproduced. Some populations declined gradually, while others disappeared entirely from regions where they had once been common. The process unfolded unevenly, yet the overall pattern moved toward a loss of diversity that became increasingly apparent. Larger animals, dependent on consistent resources and expansive habitats, faced particular difficulty. Their survival required steady access to food and water, along with environments that could support their size and energy needs. As vegetation thinned and ecosystems became less reliable, these requirements were harder to meet. Movements that once allowed them to track resources over wide areas became less effective when those resources themselves grew scarce or unpredictable. Over time, their numbers decreased, and in many cases, they vanished from the landscapes they had inhabited. Smaller and more adaptable species responded differently. Organisms capable of adjusting their diet, behavior, or habitat found ways to persist, even as conditions shifted. These survivors were not necessarily dominant in earlier ecosystems, but their flexibility allowed them to endure where others could not. Their presence did not restore the complexity that had been lost, but it marked a transition toward communities shaped by resilience rather than specialization. The decline of biodiversity altered the structure of land ecosystems in ways that extended beyond individual species. Interactions that had once linked plants, herbivores, and predators became less frequent, reducing the complexity of these systems. With fewer species to fill each role, the connections that supported balance weakened, leaving ecosystems more vulnerable to further change. What remained was not simply a smaller version of what had existed before, but a different arrangement, defined by limitation rather than abundance. As these changes continued, the land took on a quieter character, not in sound, but in activity and variation. The richness that had once defined these environments gave way to a narrower range of forms, each occupying space with fewer interactions to sustain them. The disappearance of many species did not erase life entirely, but it reduced it to a state where survival depended on adaptability above all else, shaping a world where only certain forms could continue within the conditions that remained. Movement remained, but it no longer filled the landscape in the way it once had. Across land and sea, activity became more spaced, more intermittent, as if the underlying rhythm of life had slowed without ever fully stopping. Where interactions had once overlapped in constant exchange, there were now longer intervals between them, leaving stretches of time and space where little seemed to happen at all. With fewer species present, the number of connections linking organisms together declined. Each remaining form of life occupied its place with less competition, but also with fewer relationships to sustain it. Feeding, reproduction, and movement continued, yet these processes occurred within a narrower framework, shaped by what was still available, rather than by the abundance that had defined earlier systems. The richness of interaction gave way to a quieter pattern, where fewer exchanges carried the weight of maintaining the system. On land, this shift altered how ecosystems functioned at a fundamental level. Plants that remained continued to grow where conditions allowed, but the variety of forms had diminished, reducing the range of structures and resources they provided. Animals moved through these environments with less overlap, encountering one another less often and shaping their behavior around scarcity rather than diversity. The spaces between organisms grew wider, and with that distance came a reduction in the complexity that had once characterized these landscapes. In the oceans, the same pattern unfolded in a different form. Life persisted in regions where conditions remained within tolerable limits, but the density of organisms was reduced, and the pathways that connected them became less intricate. Energy still moved through the system, yet it followed fewer routes, passing through simplified chains that lacked the branching complexity of earlier times. The result was not an absence of life, but a form of existence that operated with fewer interactions and less variation. This quieting extended beyond visible activity into the underlying processes that supported ecosystems. Nutrient cycles continued, but at altered rates, influenced by the reduced number of organisms participating in them. The exchange between different parts of the environment remained, yet it carried less diversity, reflecting the narrower range of life forms contributing to it. Stability, once maintained through many overlapping connections, now depended on a smaller set of relationships that were more easily disrupted. The atmosphere of the planet, shaped by these changes, reflected this transition. There was no single feature that marked the shift, no boundary that separated what had been from what had become. Instead, the difference lay in the overall character of the world, in the reduced frequency of interaction, the diminished variety of forms, and the quieter flow of energy through ecosystems. This period did not erase life, but it redefined its presence, creating a state where survival continued within a more limited framework. The planet remained active, yet the scale and richness of that activity had been reduced, leaving behind an environment where biological processes persisted with less intensity, shaped by the cumulative effects of changes that had unfolded across every system. Not all change carries the same weight, and not all disruptions unfold in isolation. What gave this period its intensity was the way different processes aligned, each one influencing the others, creating a system where pressures accumulated without relief. Instead of a single disturbance that could be absorbed or adjusted to, multiple forces acted together, shaping conditions that no part of the environment could escape. The atmosphere shifted as gases altered its composition, holding more heat and changing how energy moved across the planet. This change did not remain confined to the air, but extended downward, influencing surface conditions on land and across the oceans. At the same time, the warming of the planet altered water circulation, reducing the exchange that had once maintained oxygen levels and supported diverse marine life. These systems, once balanced through continuous interaction, began to move in a shared direction, reinforcing one another rather than counteracting. Within the oceans, reduced oxygen and the spread of toxic compounds created environments that limited the survival of many organisms. On land, shifting climate patterns affected vegetation, altering the availability of resources and the structure of ecosystems. Each of these changes might have been manageable on its own, but together they formed a network of stress that extended across every level of life. Adaptation, which depends on stability in at least some aspects of the environment, became increasingly difficult as multiple conditions changed at once. The interaction between these factors created feedback loops that intensified their effects. As temperatures rose, oxygen levels declined, and as oxygen declined, microbial processes altered the chemistry of the oceans further. Changes in vegetation influenced atmospheric composition, which in turn affected climate patterns, continuing the cycle. These interconnected responses meant that no single system could return to its previous state independently, as each was tied to the others through processes that had shifted together. Recovery, in such a context, required more than the adjustment of individual species. It depended on the restoration of balance across multiple systems at once, a condition that was difficult to achieve while the underlying forces remained active. Even as some organisms adapted or new forms emerged, the environment itself continued to present challenges that limited the extent of recovery. Stability, once supported by a wide range of interactions, could not be reestablished quickly when those interactions had been reduced or altered. What distinguished this event was not only the number of changes occurring, but their alignment in time and effect. The atmosphere, oceans, and land did not respond independently, but as parts of a connected whole, each carrying forward the influence of the others. This convergence created conditions that were more severe than any single factor could produce, shaping a period where life faced constraints on multiple fronts simultaneously. In this convergence, the severity of the event emerged not from a singular cause, but from the way many causes combined, each reinforcing the next, creating an environment where survival depended on navigating a system that had shifted in nearly every aspect at once. In the layers of stone that record this interval, there are stretches where complexity becomes difficult to find, where the signatures of diverse ecosystems give way to simpler patterns that reflect a world operating with far fewer components. These layers do not suggest a complete absence of life, but they indicate a point where the structures that support complexity had been reduced to a narrow range, leaving only what could endure within those limits. Across both land and sea, the systems that once connected organisms into intricate networks had been stripped back to more basic forms. Interactions that required stable conditions and reliable exchanges had largely disappeared, replaced by relationships that functioned under constraint. The variety of roles within ecosystems diminished, and with that reduction came a loss of resilience, as fewer pathways existed to support recovery or adaptation. The organisms that remained were often those capable of tolerating wide ranges of environmental conditions. Their survival did not depend on precise balances, but on flexibility, allowing them to persist where others could not. Yet even these survivors existed within environments that offered limited opportunity for expansion. Growth was possible, but it occurred within boundaries that had not yet returned to the stability needed for more complex systems to reemerge. Evidence preserved in sediments and fossil records suggests that this reduction approached a point where the continuation of complex life was uncertain. The conditions that had sustained diversity for long spans of time had shifted so extensively that the margin for survival became exceptionally narrow. Ecosystems did not vanish entirely, but they were reduced to forms that lacked the depth and interconnection that define robust biological systems. Recovery, when it began, did not proceed quickly. The processes required to rebuild complexity unfolded over immense periods as new interactions formed gradually and environmental conditions stabilized enough to support them. Species that had survived began to diversify, but this diversification moved slowly, constrained by the lingering effects of earlier changes. The rebuilding of ecosystems required not only the presence of organisms, but the restoration of the relationships that link them together. During this extended interval, the planet remained in a state that reflected both survival and limitation. Life persisted, yet it did so within a framework that had been reduced to its most essential elements. The richness that had once characterized the world was absent, replaced by systems that operated with fewer components and less variation. Over time, these systems expanded, but the path toward greater complexity required sustained stability that had not yet fully returned. What emerges from this record is a sense of how close life came to losing the structures that allow it to flourish in diverse and interconnected ways. The continuation of life did not guarantee the preservation of complexity, and for a time, the planet existed in a state where that complexity had nearly disappeared. The boundary between persistence and collapse was approached closely, leaving behind evidence of a world that had endured, yet had done so within conditions that allowed only the most adaptable forms to remain. Amid the widespread reduction of life, persistence did not disappear entirely, but shifted toward forms that could exist without relying on narrow conditions. Survival, in this altered world, favored organisms capable of flexibility, those that could function across a wider range of environments and adjust to changes that would have exceeded the limits of more specialized species. These survivors did not restore what had been lost, but they carried forward the continuity of life within the constraints that remained. Small organisms, in particular, found advantages in their size and simplicity. Their lower energy requirements allowed them to endure conditions where resources were limited, and their shorter life cycles enabled quicker responses to environmental shifts. In marine environments, simple forms continued to persist, maintaining basic ecological functions even as more complex systems had diminished. These organisms did not require stable, intricate networks to survive, and this independence allowed them to occupy spaces that had become inhospitable to others. On land, a similar pattern emerged among animals capable of adapting their behavior and diet. Generalist species, able to consume a variety of food sources and inhabit different environments, were less dependent on any single condition. This flexibility provided a degree of resilience, allowing them to continue where more specialized organisms could not. Their survival did not indicate stability, but rather an ability to endure within instability, navigating a landscape that offered fewer consistent resources. Among these survivors were early reptilian forms and mammal-like animals, whose physiology and behavior allowed them to withstand broader environmental variation. Some could regulate their activity in response to changing temperatures, while others could exploit different types of food when preferred sources became scarce. These traits did not make them dominant, but they allowed them to persist through a period when persistence itself had become rare. The environments they occupied were far from ideal. Conditions remained difficult, and the range of available habitats was reduced compared to earlier times. Yet, within these limitations, life continued in forms that required less from their surroundings. The absence of competition in some areas provided opportunities for these organisms to expand, even as the overall diversity of life remained low. In the oceans, simple communities maintained a presence, sustaining basic cycles that would later support more complex forms. Though reduced in scale, these systems preserved the processes necessary for recovery, carrying forward the elements that could eventually be built upon. Their persistence ensured that the ocean did not become entirely devoid of life, but instead retained a foundation upon which future ecosystems could develop. What remained after this period was not a reflection of the world that had existed before, but a continuation shaped by endurance rather than abundance. The few that survived did so not because conditions favored them in the past, but because they could function within a world that had changed beyond recognition. Their presence marked the beginning of a new phase, one where life persisted quietly, maintaining itself within limits that would only slowly begin to expand again. Time continued to move forward, yet the pace of change within living systems did not match the passage of years in any immediate sense. After the widespread reductions that had reshaped both land and sea, the return of complexity did not begin as a rapid rebuilding, but as a prolonged interval where little seemed to shift beyond the quiet persistence of what remained. The conditions that had limited life did not disappear all at once, and without their full release, recovery unfolded with a measured and uneven rhythm. Across different regions, environments began to stabilize in fragments rather than as a unified whole. Some areas experienced slight improvements, where temperatures and chemical balances moved closer to ranges that could support a broader range of organisms. In other places, instability lingered, maintaining conditions that restricted growth and prevented the establishment of more intricate systems. This variation meant that recovery did not occur simultaneously, but as a series of isolated developments that gradually expanded over time. Within these recovering regions, ecosystems remained simple, composed of relatively few species interacting in limited ways. The pathways through which energy and nutrients moved were still narrow, lacking the branching complexity that would later define more developed systems. Organisms that had survived continued to occupy their roles, but the opportunities for diversification were constrained by the environment. Each step toward increased complexity required conditions that could sustain it, and those conditions returned only gradually. The process of rebuilding involved not only the appearance of new species, but the re-establishment of connections between them. Relationships that had once formed dense networks needed to develop again, linking producers, consumers, and the various levels in between. This required stability over extended periods, allowing interactions to become consistent enough to support growth. Where such stability was absent, progress remained limited and ecosystems continued to function in simplified forms. The planet itself reflected this extended transition. Climate patterns, atmospheric composition, and ocean chemistry did not immediately return to their previous states, but continued to fluctuate within ranges that could challenge emerging systems. These lingering instabilities influenced how and where life could expand, shaping the pace at which recovery could proceed. The environment was no longer in the extreme condition it had reached earlier, yet it had not fully settled into a stable equilibrium either. Over immense spans of time, these gradual improvements began to accumulate, allowing life to extend into new areas and explore new forms. However, the interval between collapse and recovery remained marked by its length and its quiet character. There were no sudden bursts of complexity, no rapid return to previous richness, but a steady unfolding that required patience on a scale far beyond immediate perception. In this long silence, life persisted and slowly rebuilt, guided by the gradual return of conditions that could support it. The world did not remain empty, but it carried a sense of incompleteness, as if the processes that once defined it were still finding their way back, step by step, within an environment that was only beginning to settle into a new form. From what remained, change did not arrive as a sudden return to complexity, but as a gradual widening of possibility, where small variations began to accumulate and take hold within environments that were slowly becoming more stable. The survivors, once limited to narrow conditions, found themselves in spaces where pressure had eased just enough to allow new forms to emerge, each shaped by the constraints that had defined the period before. In these recovering systems, evolution proceeded with a quiet persistence, building upon the traits that had allowed survival in the first place. Flexibility, tolerance, and efficiency remained essential, guiding the development of new species that could occupy roles left vacant by those that had disappeared. These emerging forms did not replicate what had been lost, but instead reflected the altered conditions of the world, creating ecosystems that were both familiar and entirely new. Empty ecological roles, once defined by the interactions of previous species, became available for occupation. These spaces did not remain unfilled for long, as organisms adapted to take advantage of the opportunities they presented. New relationships formed, linking producers, consumers, and predators into systems that gradually increased in complexity. Each connection strengthened the stability of the environment, allowing further diversification to occur in a slow but steady progression. On land, vegetation began to spread into areas where conditions had become more favorable, establishing the foundation for expanding ecosystems. Plants that could tolerate a range of moisture and temperature conditions formed the basis for new communities, supporting herbivores that in turn sustained predators. These interactions developed over extended periods, with each level depending on the continued stability of the others. Growth was not uniform, but it moved forward in regions where the environment allowed it. In the oceans, similar patterns unfolded as marine life expanded into spaces that had once been limited by low oxygen and toxicity. Simple systems gave way to more intricate networks as new species occupied roles that supported the flow of energy through the water. The rebuilding of these systems required the restoration of connections that had been lost, a process that depended on both environmental stability and the gradual diversification of life. The pace of this renewal remained measured, reflecting the time required for complex interactions to develop. Each new species added to the structure of the ecosystem, but the full richness of earlier periods was not immediately restored. Instead, life advanced through stages, moving from simplicity toward greater diversity as conditions continued to improve. What emerged from this process was not a return to the past, but the beginning of a different chapter in the history of the planet. The systems that formed were shaped by what had endured, carrying forward the influence of earlier events while establishing new patterns of interaction. Life rebuilt itself from the foundations that remained, expanding slowly into a world that, though changed, once again allowed for growth and connection. The shape of life did not return to what it had been, even as stability slowly reestablished itself across the planet. Instead, the world settled into a configuration that reflected both loss and adaptation, where the patterns of interaction and dominance had shifted into forms that no longer mirrored the past. What emerged was not a restoration, but a reorganization, guided by the conditions that now defined the environment. Ecosystems that formed during this period carried a different structure from those that had existed before. The connections between organisms developed along new pathways, influenced by the traits that had allowed survival through earlier disruptions. Species that expanded into newly available roles did so without the presence of many former competitors, shaping communities that were less constrained by previous balances and more defined by opportunity within altered conditions. On land, the distribution of vegetation and animal life reflected these changes. Plant communities established themselves in patterns shaped by the new climate, supporting herbivores that had adapted to a broader range of resources. Predators followed, forming relationships that differed from those of earlier times. These systems were functional, yet they lacked the exact complexity and arrangement that had once characterized them, creating environments that felt familiar in their processes but distinct in their composition. In the oceans, a similar transformation unfolded. Marine life diversified again, filling ecological roles that had been left vacant, yet the organisms that occupied these roles were not the same as those that had once defined them. The rebuilding of marine ecosystems introduced new forms that interacted in ways shaped by the lingering effects of previous changes. Circulation patterns, chemical balances, and biological interactions combined to create systems that were stable yet fundamentally different from their predecessors. The emergence of new dominant species marked another shift in the structure of life. These organisms rose to prominence not because they resembled what had come before, but because they were suited to the conditions that now prevailed. Their success influenced the direction of further evolution, guiding the development of ecosystems along paths that diverged from earlier histories. Dominance, in this context, became a reflection of adaptability within a changed world. What had been lost did not fully return. Entire groups of organisms and the relationships they supported remained absent, leaving gaps that were filled in different ways. The memory of those earlier systems persisted only in the record of the Earth itself, while the living world moved forward, shaped by new constraints and possibilities. The continuity of life remained intact, yet its expression had been altered in ways that could not be reversed. In this new configuration, the planet carried both the imprint of its past and the influence of its transformation. Life continued to expand and diversify, but it did so within a framework that had been reshaped at a fundamental level. The Earth that emerged from this period was not the same as the one that had existed before, but a version that had adapted to change, carrying forward a different balance that would define the chapters that followed. In the aftermath of reduction, the absence of former dominance created a landscape of possibility, where ecological space no longer remained occupied by the structures that had once defined it. This openness did not fill immediately, but it allowed for a gradual expansion of groups that had previously existed in smaller or less influential roles. Freed from earlier constraints, These organisms began to explore forms and behaviors that would shape the direction of life moving forward. Among the most responsive to these conditions were reptilian lineages, whose adaptability and diversity allowed them to expand into a wide range of environments. With fewer competitors and altered ecosystems, these groups diversified, giving rise to forms that varied in size, structure, and function. This diversification did not occur in isolation, but in parallel with the slow rebuilding of ecosystems, where each new species contributed to the developing complexity of the world. The traits that had supported survival during the earlier period continued to influence this expansion. Flexibility in diet, tolerance of environmental variation, and efficiency in resource use allowed certain reptiles to establish themselves across different habitats. As conditions stabilized further, these traits became the foundation upon which new adaptations could develop, leading to a broad array of forms that interacted within the emerging ecosystems. Within this expanding diversity, early members of the group that would later include dinosaurs began to appear. These organisms did not yet dominate their environments, but they carried characteristics that would later prove significant. Their presence marked the beginning of a lineage that would, over time, come to shape terrestrial ecosystems in profound ways. At this stage, however, they existed alongside many other forms, part of a broader pattern of diversification rather than a singular rise. The process through which these groups expanded was gradual, shaped by the continued stabilization of environmental systems. As climate patterns became more consistent and ecosystems gained complexity, opportunities for specialization increased. Organisms adapted to specific roles within these systems, creating interactions that supported further diversification. This interplay between environment and adaptation guided the development of life along paths that had not existed before the earlier disruptions. What distinguished this period was not a sudden emergence of dominance, but a steady progression toward it. The groundwork was laid through the expansion of reptilian groups and the gradual establishment of new ecological relationships. Over time, these developments would lead to shifts in which certain lineages became more prominent, influenced by their ability to adapt and compete within the evolving environment. The world that moved toward the age of dinosaurs was therefore shaped by both the absence of previous systems and the opportunities created by that absence. Life advanced through exploration of new forms and interactions, building complexity step by step. The transformation did not erase what had come before, but it redirected the course of evolution, setting in motion patterns that would define the next era of life on Earth. Beneath the surface of the present world, layers of stone rest quietly, each one formed from sediments that settled long ago, carrying within them the record of conditions that no longer exist. These layers do not speak in words or images, yet they preserve patterns that, when read carefully, reveal the sequence of changes that reshaped life across the planet. The story is not written in a single place, but distributed across continents and oceans, recorded in fragments that align when viewed together. Within these layers, fossils appear and then, at certain boundaries, cease to appear in the way they once did. Species that had been common through earlier deposits become rare or absent, leaving behind a contrast that marks a transition in the history of life. This absence is not always immediate, but when viewed across successive layers, it forms a pattern that reflects the decline and disappearance of entire groups. The continuity that had once defined these records gives way to interruption, signaling that something fundamental had changed. The preservation of these remains provides more than a record of presence or absence. It reveals shifts in the structure of ecosystems. As the variety of forms within each layer decreases and the complexity of interactions becomes more limited. Where once there had been diverse assemblages of organisms, later layers show simpler communities, reflecting the reduction in biodiversity that unfolded during this period. These patterns allow the sequence of events to be traced, even though the changes themselves occurred gradually over time. Alongside fossils, the chemical composition of the rocks carries additional evidence of environmental transformation. Variations in the ratios of certain elements, preserved within sediments, indicate changes in atmospheric and oceanic conditions. Signals related to carbon cycles suggest alterations in how energy moved through the planet, while traces of sulfur compounds point to shifts in the chemistry of both water and air. These markers do not describe events directly, but they reflect the processes that shape them. The alignment of these chemical signals across distant locations reinforces the idea that the changes were not isolated, but global in scope. Rocks formed in different environments show similar patterns, suggesting that the forces influencing them operated across the entire planet. This consistency allows scientists to reconstruct the broader context of the event, linking local observations into a coherent picture of global transformation. What emerges from these records is a layered account of change, where biological and chemical evidence intersect. Fossils reveal how life responded, while the surrounding material preserves the conditions that influenced those responses. Together, they form a narrative that extends beyond any single type of evidence, providing a more complete understanding of how the planet shifted during this period. The stone itself remains unchanged in the present, yet within it lies the memory of a world that moved through profound transformation. By examining these layers, it becomes possible to trace the sequence of events that led from stability to disruption and, eventually, toward recovery, all recorded in materials that have endured long after the conditions they represent have passed. Far below the reach of light, where fine particles settle through water over long stretches of time, the ocean floor became a place where subtle changes were recorded with quiet precision. Layer upon layer of sediment gathered, each one preserving traces of the conditions that existed when it was formed. These deposits, undisturbed for immense periods, now hold within them a detailed account of how the ocean changed during this interval. Within these sediments, the absence or presence of certain minerals reveals shifts in oxygen levels that cannot be seen directly. In environments where oxygen was abundant, specific compounds formed and settled into the layers. Where oxygen declined, different chemical signatures appeared, marking the expansion of conditions that supported alternative processes. These variations, preserved in sequence, allow a reconstruction of how low oxygen zones developed and spread across different regions of the ocean. Alongside these indicators, traces of sulfur-bearing compounds provide further insight into the presence of toxic conditions. In layers where hydrogen sulfide influenced the environment, the chemistry of the sediment reflects this interaction, leaving behind markers that distinguish these periods from those that came before. These signals do not describe the movement of the gas itself, but they reveal where and when it affected the water, offering a window into the extent of its influence. Changes in carbon cycles are also recorded within these deposits, captured in the ratios of different forms of carbon preserved in organic material and surrounding minerals. Variations in these ratios indicate disruptions in how carbon moved between the atmosphere, oceans, and living organisms. Such shifts suggest that the processes governing energy flow across the planet had been altered, affecting both climate and biological activity in ways that extended far beyond individual ecosystems. The consistency of these patterns across distant ocean basins strengthens their significance. Sediments formed in separate regions display similar chemical changes, indicating that the transformations were not confined to isolated areas, but occurred on a global scale. This alignment allows scientists to connect observations from different locations, building a broader understanding of how the oceans responded as part of an interconnected system. Reconstructing these events requires careful interpretation of the evidence preserved in these layers. Each chemical signal provides a piece of information, and when combined, they form a sequence that reflects the progression of environmental change. The process does not rely on a single type of data, but on the integration of multiple indicators, each contributing to a more complete picture of what occurred. Through this approach, the ancient oceans reveal their history not through direct observation, but through the patterns left behind in materials that have endured. These clues, gathered from sediments that once settled quietly through the water, allow the unfolding of events to be traced with increasing clarity, connecting changes in chemistry to the broader transformations that shaped life across the planet. Deep beneath the surface, where the slow movement of mantle material shapes the outer layers of the planet, a process unfolded that would influence everything above it. The forces driving volcanic activity did not act in isolation or for a brief moment, but persisted over extended spans, releasing vast quantities of material and gases that entered the atmosphere and oceans in a continuous stream. This sustained activity formed the starting point for a sequence of changes that spread outward through every connected system. The gases released during these eruptions altered the composition of the atmosphere in ways that affected how energy moved across the planet. Carbon dioxide accumulated steadily, changing the balance between incoming sunlight and outgoing heat. As more energy remained within the lower atmosphere, temperatures began to rise, not abruptly, but with a consistency that allowed the effect to build over time. This warming did not remain confined to a single region, but extended across land and sea, influencing climate patterns and the stability of environments that had long supported diverse life. As temperatures increased, the oceans responded in ways that reflected their connection to the atmosphere. Warmer conditions reduced the ability of water to hold dissolved oxygen, while changes in circulation limited the renewal of oxygen in deeper regions. These shifts created environments where the balance necessary for complex marine life became increasingly difficult to maintain. At the same time, chemical processes within the ocean began to change, influenced by both temperature and the introduction of new compounds from volcanic emissions. Among these changes was the expansion of conditions that allowed certain microbial processes to dominate, altering the chemistry of the water further. The production of toxic substances, combined with declining oxygen levels, created environments that placed additional stress on marine organisms. These developments did not occur independently, but were linked through feedback mechanisms that reinforced their effects. As one change progressed, it influenced others, creating a network of interactions that amplified the overall transformation. On land, the influence of these processes extended through shifts in climate and atmospheric composition. Vegetation responded to changes in temperature and moisture, altering the structure of ecosystems and the availability of resources for animal life. These adjustments, in turn, influenced the atmosphere through changes in carbon exchange, contributing to the ongoing cycle of transformation. Each system affected the others, creating a situation where no single factor could be considered in isolation. What emerges from this sequence is not a single cause, but a convergence of processes that acted together, each reinforcing the next. Volcanic activity initiated the chain, but its effects spread through the atmosphere, oceans, and land in ways that connected every part of the planet. The resulting changes formed a system where multiple pressures operated simultaneously, shaping conditions that limited the ability of life to adapt. In this convergence, the transformation of the Earth can be understood as the outcome of interacting systems, each contributing to a broader shift that extended beyond any individual process. The cause was not singular, but collective, reflecting the way the planet's systems are linked and how changes within one can move outward to influence all others. Adaptation depends on time, on the gradual accumulation of small changes that allow organisms to adjust to shifting conditions while maintaining the processes that sustain them. When the pace of environmental change remains within certain bounds, life can respond through variation and selection, shaping new forms that align with new circumstances. In this period, however, the rate and combination of changes moved beyond what many species could accommodate, compressing what would normally unfold over extended intervals into a sequence that allowed little room for adjustment. As temperature, atmospheric composition, and ocean chemistry shifted together, organisms encountered multiple forms of stress at once. Each of these pressures influenced survival in different ways, altering metabolism, reproduction, and the ability to maintain internal balance. While some variation existed within populations, the speed at which conditions moved made it difficult for these variations to spread and establish before further changes occurred. Adaptation requires stability long enough for beneficial traits to persist, yet stability had become increasingly rare. Species that depended on narrow environmental conditions faced particular difficulty. Their specialization, which had once allowed them to thrive within stable ecosystems, became a limitation as those conditions changed. Adaptations, finely tuned to specific temperatures, oxygen levels, or resource availability, could not easily be modified without disrupting other essential functions. As their environments shifted beyond these narrow ranges, these species had little capacity to adjust, leading to gradual decline and eventual disappearance. Even organisms with broader tolerances encountered limits. The accumulation of stress across different systems reduced the overall capacity for survival, as energy that might have supported growth or reproduction was redirected toward maintaining basic functions. This reduction in available energy influenced population dynamics, slowing reproduction and increasing vulnerability to further environmental pressures. Over time, these effects compounded, reducing the ability of species to recover from losses. The interaction between these factors created a situation where the threshold for survival was exceeded in many environments. Conditions did not need to become extreme in any single dimension to have significant effects. Instead, the combination of moderate changes across multiple variables produced a level of stress that was difficult to withstand. Organisms were not adapting to one challenge at a time, but to several simultaneously, each one influencing the others in ways that increased their overall impact. Movement offered limited relief, as suitable environments became less common and more fragmented. Shifting location could provide temporary improvement, but the broader trend of change meant that these refuges were often short-lived. The capacity to migrate did not guarantee survival when the conditions necessary for persistence were themselves unstable. What emerged from this period was a recognition of the limits of adaptation when confronted with rapid and interconnected change. Evolution remained an ongoing process, yet its pace could not match the rate at which the environment was transforming. The result was not a failure of life itself, but a mismatch between the speed of change and the mechanisms available to respond, leaving many species unable to adjust before the conditions that supported them had already moved beyond reach. No single part of the planet exists in isolation, and the events of this period reveal how deeply connected every system truly is. Changes that began far beneath the surface moved outward through the atmosphere, across the oceans, and into the structures of life itself, linking processes that might otherwise seem separate. What started in one domain did not remain contained, but traveled through the pathways that bind air, water, land, and living systems together. The interactions between these systems create a balance that allows complexity to develop and persist. When this balance is maintained, variations can be absorbed and life can adjust through gradual adaptation. Yet when multiple changes occur together, each influencing the others, the capacity of the system to stabilize itself becomes limited. The connections that once supported resilience begin to carry instability instead, spreading its effects across wider areas. The sequence of events demonstrates how small shifts, when sustained and interconnected, can grow into transformations that affect the entire planet. A change in atmospheric composition influences temperature, which alters ocean conditions, which in turn reshapes ecosystems both in water and on land. Each step builds upon the previous one, creating a chain of influence that extends far beyond its origin. The scale of the outcome is not determined by a single moment, but by the accumulation of changes that reinforce one another over time. Within this framework, stability emerges as a crucial condition for the development of complex life. Diversity, intricate food webs, and specialized relationships all depend on environments that remain within certain limits. When those limits shift too quickly or too extensively, the structures that support complexity begin to weaken. Adaptation can occur, but it requires time and continuity, conditions that were reduced during this period. The persistence of life, even under these constraints, highlights its capacity to endure. Yet it also underscores the boundaries within which that endurance operates. Survival does not guarantee the preservation of complexity, and the rebuilding of intricate systems requires the gradual restoration of balance across multiple domains. The lessons of this event are therefore not only about loss, but about the conditions necessary for recovery and growth. These patterns continue to shape the way the planet functions, reflecting the ongoing interaction between physical processes and living systems. The connections that allowed change to spread also provide the pathways through which stability can return, linking recovery to the same networks that once carried disruption. Understanding these relationships offers insight into how the Earth responds to change, not as a collection of separate parts, but as a unified system where each component influences the others. In this interconnected world, the history of transformation becomes a guide to the nature of balance itself, showing how delicate it can be, how easily it can shift, and how essential it remains for the continued development of life in all its forms. Change did not reverse itself, yet over long stretches of time, the conditions shaping the planet began to settle into patterns that allowed life to expand once more. The processes that had once driven instability gradually eased, not through a sudden return to earlier states, but through a slow rebalancing in which temperature, chemistry, and circulation moved toward ranges that could sustain broader forms of life. This shift did not restore what had been lost, but it created a foundation upon which new systems could continue to grow. Organisms that had persisted through earlier constraints remained the basis for this renewal. Their ability to tolerate variation allowed them to occupy environments that were becoming more stable, and from this position they began to diversify further. Over extended periods, small changes accumulated, leading to new forms that were better suited to the conditions that now prevailed. Adaptation continued as an ongoing process, shaped by the gradual stabilization of the environment rather than by abrupt shifts. Ecosystems developed through the re-establishment of connections between organisms, forming networks that became more intricate as diversity increased. The movement of energy through these systems expanded, supported by the presence of producers, consumers, and the various interactions linking them. Each new connection contributed to the overall stability of the system, allowing further complexity to emerge. This rebuilding did not follow a single path, but occurred across different regions at varying rates, reflecting local conditions and the availability of resources. The oceans, once limited by reduced oxygen and altered chemistry, began to support more varied communities as circulation patterns improved and chemical balances shifted. Marine life expanded into areas that had previously been constrained, forming ecosystems that gradually increased in complexity. On land, vegetation spread more consistently across landscapes, supporting the growth of animal populations that depended on these resources. The interactions between these systems strengthened over time, reinforcing the stability that allowed life to continue diversifying. This recovery unfolded across immense spans, requiring patience beyond immediate perception. Each stage built upon the previous one, creating a progression that moved from simplicity toward greater diversity. The conditions necessary for this development did not appear all at once, but emerged gradually as the environment stabilized. The result was a world that could once again support complex interactions, though in forms that differed from those that had existed before. The planet itself reflected this gradual return to balance. Atmospheric composition, climate patterns, and ocean chemistry settled into states that allowed systems to function with greater consistency. These changes did not erase the effects of earlier transformations, but they provided the stability required for life to expand beyond the limitations it had faced. In this extended process, recovery became not a single event, but a continuous unfolding where life adapted to new conditions and ecosystems rebuilt themselves step by step. The Earth that emerged from this period carried the memory of its transformation, yet it also demonstrated the capacity of its systems to stabilize and support the ongoing development of life in a form that continued to evolve. There are moments in the history of this planet when the continuity of life narrows to something almost unrecognizable, where the vast diversity that once defined the world contracts into a quieter, more fragile presence. This period stands as one of those moments, a point where the systems that sustain life shifted so deeply that only a small portion of what existed before was able to continue. The record left behind does not show a complete absence, but it reveals how close the living world came to losing the structures that allow it to flourish. From that narrow margin, everything that exists today has its origin. The forms that survived carried forward the processes that make life possible, maintaining continuity through conditions that no longer supported complexity in its earlier form. Over time, those survivors became the foundation for new ecosystems, new interactions, and new expressions of life, all shaped by the constraints and changes that had come before. The world that followed did not return to its previous state, but it continued from what remained, building again in a different direction. The transformation of the Earth during this interval shows how systems that appear stable can change when underlying conditions shift. Atmosphere, oceans, and land are not separate in their influence, but connected through processes that move across boundaries, linking one change to another. When these connections carry disruption rather than balance, the effects extend outward, reshaping environments in ways that are not always immediately visible, yet deeply influential over time. This continuity of change reflects a planet that is always in motion, even when that motion is slow and difficult to perceive. Stability allows life to grow in complexity, yet that stability depends on conditions that can evolve, sometimes gradually, sometimes in ways that alter the entire system. The history preserved in stone and sediment offers a perspective on how these changes unfold, showing that even the most established systems are part of a dynamic process. As this story settles, there remains a quiet space for reflection, a moment to consider which part of this long sequence lingers most clearly, whether it is the subtle beginning, the unfolding transformation, or the gradual return that followed. Each stage carries its own significance, forming a continuous thread that connects past and present. For those drawn to these hidden chapters of Earth's history, where science and storytelling meet in a calm exploration of change and continuity, there is always more to uncover. If this journey through one of the planet's most profound transformations has stayed with you, you are welcome to continue exploring alongside the snoozy scientist, where each story unfolds gently, one quiet discovery at a time.